Red alert in the Kremlin. Russian leader Vladimir Putin's last hope has been destroyed by the Ukrainian army. The train full of Russian troops sent by Vladimir Putin to Ukrainian territory has been neutralized by the Ukrainian army, according to the latest data. More than 300 Russian soldiers are said to have lost their lives while the Russian army's repression on Ukrainian territory continues. The Ukrainian army has been showing great resistance in the city of Bakhmut for months. The Russian army, which managed to capture the city of Soledar, has now directed all its intensity to the Bakhmut front. However, the Russian army has not been able to capture the city of Bakhmut for months, and this has started to disturb Vladimir Putin. Putin, who wanted to increase his offensive in Bakhmut, also wanted to send Russian troops stationed on Ukrainian territory to Bakhmut. Putin wanted to send the troops from the Russian headquarters in the Donetsk region to Bakhmut, prepared a large shipment train. However, this train full of Russian troops was destroyed by unmanned fighter jets sent by the Ukrainian army. Ukrainian state leader Volodymyr Zelensky deployed a large number of Ukrainian soldiers to the Bakhmut front in order not to lose the city of Bakhmut. Thanks to the 17-kilometer defense line that the Ukrainian army has established here, the Russian army is not allowed to pass here. When Valery Gerasimov, the Russian chief of staff, realized that he could not capture the city of Bakhmut with ground attacks, he started to turn to air strikes with Gerasimov order for Russian Su-27 fighter jets set up for the Bakhmut front. Russian pilots entered the Bakhmut airspace without any problems and took action to neutralize the defense line formed by the Ukrainian army. However, the Russian pilots were unaware of the air defense systems deployed behind the Ukrainian defense line. Two of the Russian warplanes approached to fire their missiles at the Ukrainian soldiers. However, at that very moment, one of the Ukrainian soldiers on the defense line targeted the Russian warplane with a portable anti-aircraft missile and fired it. Within seconds, the missile hit the Russian fighter jet and destroyed it after the plane crashed. All the Russian pilots wanted to attack, but they noticed the air defense systems deployed in Bakhmut forced to cancel the airstrike. The Russian pilots returned to the military base in Zaporizhia. This failed operation caused a major controversy in the Kremlin. On the orders of Vladimir Putin and Gerasimov, it was decided to organize a large-scale military deployment to the city of Bakhmut. However, this military operation was prevented by the Ukrainian army before it could reach its target. If we come to the details of the operation, many Russian military headquarters have been established in the Zaporizhia region, which has been under the control of the Russian army for a long time. Military and ammunition shipments are organized to many regions from Zaporizhia, which the Russian army uses as a coordination center. By order of Vladimir Putin, it was decided to send more than 800 Russian soldiers from the Russian headquarters here to the Bakhmut front. Gerasimov, who coordinated the military shipment, decided that this shipment would be made by train. The railroads between Zaporizhia and Donetsk region are one of the most frequently used supply routes of the Russian army. Russian soldiers gathered from many orders were taken to the train station in Natalia region of Zaporizhia. The Russian army, consisting of 12 units, set off for the Donetsk region by train. However, the British intelligence service informed Ukrainian authorities that the Russian army had made a large military deployment to the Donetsk region. Thereupon, Ukrainian and British intelligence jointly determined the route to be followed by the Russian train. Unbeknownst to them, the Russian army moved to reach the Donetsk region. The Ukrainian army mobilized 6 unmanned fighter jets to prevent this train from reaching Donetsk. The unmanned warplanes mobilized from the city of Dnipro and quickly entered the Zaporizhia airspace. Ukrainian unmanned warplanes advanced to the Maryanivka region of Zaporizhia and intercepted the Russian delivery train here, descending to launch an airstrike on the train. 6 unmanned warplanes fired their missiles towards the Russian military delivery train. With the firing of the missiles, a huge explosion occurred in the engineer section of the train. 3 of the missiles successfully hit the train wagons and the train derailed. The derailed train overturned within seconds. The Russian soldiers who were surprised tried to get out of the train in order to save their lives. Having successfully completed the operation, Ukrainian unmanned fighter jets returned to the Dnipro military airbase. Shortly after the explosion of the train, Ukrainian state officials made statements with this operation. It is said that more than 250 Russian soldiers lost their lives and nearly 500 Russian soldiers were seriously wounded, while Ukrainian officials confirmed that the operation took place and that many Russian soldiers lost their lives. There was no statement from the Russian government. Recently, the Ukrainian army has stepped up its operations against Russian forces. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is very good at hiding these events in Ukraine from his own people. When the Russian army started to occupy Ukrainian territory, the Russian people took to the streets and protested against Putin and the war, with the Russian army losing nearly 200,000 soldiers on Ukrainian soil. The anger of Russian citizens against Putin has increased considerably. The Russian people are very disturbed by Putin's failure to keep his promises. Before the war started, Vladimir Putin and Russian government officials promised that the occupation of Ukrainian territory would last for a few weeks and that no Russian soldier would even be harmed. However, very soon after the invasion began, the Russian army began to suffer one casualty after another as the Russian army began to suffer losses in Ukraine. The anti-Putin public and Putin's opponents mobilized the Russian opposition, who are uncomfortable with Putin's long-term presidency of Russia, are making great efforts to overthrow Putin's throne, as it is known after the Russian army started to occupy Ukrainian territory. The US and Western countries started to impose embargoes and sanctions against Russia. Due to these sanctions, the Russian economy entered a very turbulent period with the deterioration of the Russian economy. Inflation rates in Russia have also increased dramatically. The Russian people who did not feel the negative effects of the war in the first months of the war started to see the effects of the war with the increase in inflation rates. The Russian people who started to revolt over the rising prices of groceries and technology organized protests in many cities of Russia. Anti-war protests were launched, especially in Moscow and St. Petersburg. One of the things that Putin, who somehow managed to suppress his protests, fears the most right now is the start of a new uprising. Putin, who does not want the losses of the Russian army to be hurt with this latest operation organized by the Ukrainian army, does not allow any explanation about this operation. As it is known, Russia television channels are currently banned from broadcasting any anti-war news. In addition, in case of any news that denigrates the Russian army, the news channel is fined heavily. For this reason, the national channels in Russia do not operate independently. Putin has also managed to take over. The judiciary in Russia is very intimidated by the officials who oppose him. Many Russian dissidents are currently dealing with lawsuits filed by Putin. Previously, some officials who opposed Putin were arrested by Putin. Nevertheless, the Russian people are trying to get information from independent websites to find out what is happening in Ukraine. But Vladimir Putin is making great efforts to prevent this. More than 200,000 websites have been banned in Russia since the beginning of the war. Putin has also banned VPNs to prevent access to these websites, fearing a new uprising. Putin is very afraid that his authority will be shaken. However, according to the statements of independent polling companies in Russia, Vladimir Putin has lost more than 15% of the vote after the war started and is therefore unlikely to win the next elections. The power of armies is measured by their gains in the air, land, and sea, especially in the wars of two countries bordering each other. Land operations have a great importance in influencing the course of the war. The most effective equipment used in these operations are undoubtedly tanks and armored combat vehicles. This is clearly visible in the Russia-Ukraine war. Although the Russian army attacks the regions bordering Ukraine with tanks and armored vehicles, the Ukrainian army manages to repel almost all of these attacks. A new video released by the Ukrainian Security Service recently shows the blow dealt to the ground forces of the Russian invaders in one night. The Ukrainian army blew up 10 Russian tanks in a successful operation. Before we go into details of the spectacular attack, we have a request for you. As a daily news team, we continue to report all the developments in the Russia-Ukraine war, both on the front line and in diplomacy, with our understanding of accurate and impartial journalism. You can click the Super Thanks button to support our teammates and our work. Footage of the attacks in which 10 Russian tanks were blown up was shared on the official social media account of the Ukrainian Security Service. It appears that the footage was recorded by the camera of an unmanned aerial vehicle. The Ukrainian army carried out a series of attacks on the occupation zones where Russian tanks were concentrated. In this operation, which showed the effectiveness of the Air Force in the war, the Russian invaders suffered great losses. Sharing the footage of the operation, the Ukrainian Security Service wrote in its post 9 or 10 exactly how many Russian tanks destroyed the SBU White Wolves Special Force in one night. Our specialists of the Special Operations Center conducted study of enemy equipment on the dynastic direction. One opponent also burned. Thus 11 goals were scored on this own account. For one night, work was a complete victory. In the footage shared by the Security Service of Ukraine, bombs dropped by Ukrainian drones are falling on the tanks of the Russian invaders with pinpoint accuracy. The moment the bomb falls, the tank catches fire with a violent explosion. Moreover, this attack is not carried out in one area, but in several areas simultaneously. As the Russian tanks are blown up one by one, the Ukrainian army is getting closer to victory. Immediately after the Ukrainian army announced that they had destroyed 10 tanks of the Russian invaders overnight, Ukrainian Interior Advisor Anton Gerashenko announced a new loss for the Russian invaders. Gerashenko announced the loss of the invaders with a post on a social media account as follows. Soldiers of the Special Squad Code 9.2, together with 3,027 National Guards Brigade, tracked down and destroyed the pride of Russian defense industry. That 90 probably tank. Glory to Ukrainian defenders. The losses of tanks and armored vehicles of the Russian army are increasing day by day. In the past days, the Ukrainian army targeted the tanks and armored vehicles of the Russian invaders with attacks on the Bakhmut line. The 59th Motorized Brigade blew up the Russian tanks and armored combat vehicles trying to advance in Bakhmut. Russian tank and armored vehicle platoon caught in an ambush by the 59th Motorized Brigade. The tanks of the Russian invaders were trying to advance in Bakhmut by covering their soldiers, but Ukrainian soldiers were aware of both the tanks and the soldiers they concealed. Russian invaders were being monitored instantly. Ukrainian soldiers stationed on the hills overlooking the city were waiting for the right moment to attack. The T-72 tanks of the Russian invaders were now clearly visible on the target of the Javelin missiles. The time was right and the missiles were fired. The missiles hit the tanks and the tanks exploded. Well, the units of the 59th Motorized Brigade were blowing up Russian tanks. Another brigade unit was pursuing the BMP armored vehicles of the Russian invaders. Ukrainian soldiers opened heavy fire on Russian armored vehicles. Russian invaders driving the vehicle lost control. The cornered armored vehicles were neutralized by artillery shelling. Russia continues to suffer huge losses in Bakhmut. With these operations, the impact of the Ukrainian Air Force in the war is clearly demonstrated in the Russian-Ukrainian war, along with the ongoing clashes in the occupied territories. A series of new developments are taking place in the airspace of both countries. For this reason, fighter jets, helicopters, and missiles are effectively in air operations as tanks and armored vehicles are in ground operations. While the losses suffered by the Russian army on the ground are increasing day by day, the losses suffered in the air are also increasing. With the recent incident in Bakhmut, a new one has been added to the losses of the Russian occupiers. Bakhmut has witnessed hundreds of thousands of clashes in the air and on the ground since Russia began its occupation of Ukraine. So much so that the Ukrainian army announced that hundreds of clashes took place in Bakhmut in one day. Russian invaders lost tens of thousands of soldiers and tons of equipment in Bakhmut. The development in Bakhmut in the past day reveals the loss of the Russian Air Force. The 93rd Separate Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Army heard aircraft sounds while on duty in Bakhmut. This song belonged to a Russian Su-24 model jet. The soldiers headed towards the area where the sound came from and saw the Russian jet in the skies over Bakhmut. But the Russian jet did not notice the soldiers. The brigade soldiers quickly began preparations to shoot down the Russian jet. The jet was clearly visible in the skies over Bakhmut. The Su-24 jet was flying sorties in the sky over the city. Ukrainian soldiers were ready to attack, but the Russian jet had disappeared. Ukrainian soldiers continued to follow the sky, expecting to see the Russian jet at any moment. And then it happened. The Russian jet was heard again. Everything was ready for the attack. The Ukrainian soldiers, watching their prey, started firing as the Russian Su-24 fighter jet entered their range. The fighter jet in the sky turned into a ball of flames with the accurate shooting of the Ukrainian soldiers. Yes, contact. As the downed plane glided towards the ground, the Russian pilot was ejected from the plane. Thanks to the pilot ejection system on board, however, there is no information about the fate of the Russian pilot. The details of the operation carried out by the 93rd Separate Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Army were announced by Andriy Yermak, head of the Presidential Office of Ukraine. After this announcement, Ukrainians felt pride and joy, while there was great sadness on the Russian side because Russia was approaching exhaustion with the loss of soldiers and ammunition. With this loss, the Russian Air Force lost a total of 305 airplanes, 290 helicopters, and 2,159 unmanned aerial vehicles during the war. The Ukrainian army continues to terrorize the Russian invaders with a series of texts in the air and on the ground. Well, Russian leader Vladimir is wondering how to continue the war with these losses. The Russian people are calling on Putin to end the war as soon as possible. But Putin is not likely to give up the war because his personal interests are above everything. Putin is putting his people in the fire for himself. How do you interpret the successful offensive of the Ukrainian army? Will the Russian invaders be able to recover their losses? What will be the next move of the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, who is getting exhausted every day? What are your thoughts on the course of the war? We are curious about your views. Follow us for more updates. Ukrainians managed to breach several Russian defensive positions and assault multiple settlements that are protecting the northern Bakhmut flank. The main axis of the attack became Bakhmut after the regular Russian forces exhausted their offensive capabilities and failed to recapture the tactical heights around Bakhmut. As reported by the Russian Ministry of Defense, Russian forces conducted a tactical regrouping to more reliable positions. The head of the Wagner Group, Prigozhin, who spent considerable resources gaining the ground that the regular forces were losing, immediately stated that the fact that Ukrainians captured all tactical heights meant that the fall of Borovivka and the whole northern flank was just a matter of time. Over the last week, after achieving their tactical objectives in the southern part of the region, Ukrainian forces could finally prioritize the northern flank. Judging by the combat footage, Ukrainians opened multiple vectors of attack. The first attack was launched south of the railways, as Prigozhin himself mentioned in an interview. The combination of the three lines and the embankment makes it very easy for a mechanized group to quickly close the distance and assault the trenches. The second line of attack became the pathway between the reservoir and the railways. Russian sources reported that Ukrainians lost multiple tanks and armored fighting vehicles and that their attempt to take Bath completely failed. However, Berezhivka was not the main goal of this attack. The main purpose of this attack was to clear all the trenches between the reservoir and the railways in order to set conditions for what was coming next and the next. Ukrainian attacks were directed towards Yagodny. So by improving the tactical position in the vicinity of Berezhivka, Ukrainians effectively blocked the Russians from conducting a flank attack and undermining their offensive efforts. The head of the Wagner Group, Prigozhin was asked to evaluate the situation, and he said that his reconnaissance crews clearly recorded that Ukrainians had indeed populated the tree lines and entrenched themselves even more. In the meantime, the intensity of engagements around Yagodny has been increasing significantly. Russian sources indirectly confirmed that Ukrainians are attacking Bravo Canyon, while the Ukrainian deputy defense minister stated that Ukrainian forces managed to advance by up to 1.5 kilometers, which is precisely the distance between Yagodny and the previous Russian defense line in the tree lines. Ukrainian 57th Motorized Rifle Brigade released a highly graphic video of how those Russian soldiers who were trying to escape the heat only got under devastating mortar fire that instantly killed the entire squad. Ukrainian 14th Mechanized Brigade released a video showing how they were destroying Russian tanks in the vicinity of Yagodny. Ukrainian 77th Mobile Brigade showed how they are destroying enemy ammunition depots and equipment also in Yadin. The sentiment of the Ukrainian fighters that are reporting news from Bakhmut is quite positive, and they also signaled that many moves are not being reported yet. However, if everything goes according to the plan, Ukrainians will be able to slice off the Russian salient north of Bakhmut and start moving further. In fact, there is already a lot of footage that shows how Ukrainian artillery has started undermining the next Russian defense line, namely in Blahodatan and Horodnya. Today, Ukrainians also released footage of the aftermath of a successful Ukrainian attack in the vicinity of Sako-Ivanzeti. Such actions are not only stretching Russian forces along the whole front line, but also indicate that the scale of the potential offensive is much bigger. And just like last time, Ukrainians may very well end up conducting several back-to-back counter-offensive operations on various parts of the front line.